Do you know what it takes to build products used by millions of people? Today's guest, Somet, knows the answer. With nearly a decade of experience at tech companies like Google and Microsoft, Somet has been at the forefront of digital transformation, cloud solutions, and product management. Now, as the head of product at Poa Internet, he's bringing affordable internet to millions to millions in underserved communities in Africa. He brings a world of experience in product and tech and is here to share them with all of us today. Welcome to the podcast, Sumit.
Thank you very much.
Amazing. So, one of the first questions I typically ask on this podcast is, why did you pursue a career in the tech industry?
Okay. So it started off as a passion I picked up when I was young. I was an insanely curious kid, and so when my mother bought her first computer because she was, doing her post grad, I was like always curious. What does this thing do? How do I tear it apart? And for most of the times, I tore the thing apart. But then over time, I started to get curious beyond just the hardware. You know, what is the software that runs on there? And actually, that's how I ruined my eyes. But ever since I was a kid, I was curious about computers. And so all through high school, college, till now, I've sort of been in the tech industry, doing a lot of things.
So that's a nice segue to the next one then, right? So what are the different roles that you've been in tech? Because I asked that because one of the burning questions I feel like ever since COVID and people got to figure out the career flexibility, remote work, all of that tech offers. A lot of people definitely top of mind for them is switching into tech. But again, since you said you've done a lot of things, that's maybe a side that's not talked about enough, which is switching within tech. So what are
Yeah.
those different roles or opportunities or, parts of tech that you've been in?
Yeah. So I started my career in developer experience. So I was lucky enough to get into Microsoft straight out of college. Of course, by that time, I'd done the whole building websites for people, trying to build some apps. But my first formal job was actually at Microsoft as an intern in the developer experience team. And so my job was to go around all the colleges across East Africa and talk about then it was Windows Phone, Microsoft Azure, Windows, Xbox, and how to build on top of those platforms. I did that for a bit, came back, was thrown into the startup space, and that was my sort of first experience working with startups as a solution architect. And so I would go across many, many startups all over the African continent, sit down with them, understand where their challenges, where does Microsoft technology play a role, how do we start to re-architect their solution to fit the cloud. Did that for a bit, got thrown into the commercial side of Microsoft. Um, and was a partner manager. And so I worked with Microsoft partners, those that were building solutions on Microsoft Cloud and helping them figure out a commercial model where they can work with Microsoft. Then jumped from there, went back into the startup world, led the startup program across most of sub-Saharan Africa for a bit, up to and then after that, went into the product space, helped a team out of India launch a product called Microsoft Kaizala in Africa. Then I jumped into the agriculture space, and I was part of a team called Microsoft for Africa. So for most of those years, and we were trying to figure out, where does Microsoft play a role in building agriculture solutions on the continent. And then I took a step out of that, jumped into working for a startup as a consultant, helping them figure out their product. Did that for a couple of bit, took a break at some point, managed to get myself in Google as a program manager, helping the different product teams build, figured how to do research effectively on the African continent. Then left that and joined Poa Internet. And that's where I am till today as a head of product. So done quite a bit of things.
Yeah, that's definitely. I was trying to keep track. So I think you started in develop as a developer advocate. You went into Solution architecture.
Solution.
You went into
Um,
program management,
yep.
and then product. Did I keep track
Yep.
properly?
Yes. Yes, you did.
and, and that's very fascinating because you know those are many different roles. But I almost feel like, of course, one thing that stands out to me is your wealth of experience doing technology on the African continent, right? Uh,
Mhm.
that is definitely like something that gives you a very unique advantage working in these global companies because you bring that perspective. What were some of those other threads that you felt, even though like the skill sets from role to role differ? Because again, being a project is different from being a developer advocate and to being a product manager to being a solution architect. But there's still like, some fundamentals that may carry you through those different roles. So what do you think those things were?
Yeah. So for most of the roles I did, they had some technical angle to it. So having a bit of a tech background really does help, but it ideally shouldn't stop anyone. I think there's a lot of stuff that I eventually figured out. I kind of picked up on the way, but eventually figured out why they're important. One is communication, relationship building, handling conflict, working with difficult people. So this is stuff that cuts across any role you would do. But if you're able to figure out one, how to communicate, talk to people, convince people, handle difficult people, I think then it's easy sort of transition roles. But also, um, you know, um, so sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. So being able to leverage that technical skill and figure out, okay, where can I take what I've learned today, apply to a different role. So when I transitioned from a solution architect into the commercial side of Microsoft, by that time I'd spent a lot of time talking to people, listening to pitches, and so I got really good at convincing people. So leveraging my tech background and talking to decision makers, but now sort of dumbing down technology to a sense where those non-technical people can understand, and then that slowly starts to build trust. So I think if I were to sum it up all, I think it's communication and just handling people. I think is the best skill anyone can learn.
Yeah, I really like the way you said it in the beginning, and that's why I was smiling because you said, I kind of like figured it was all important, but I picked it up along the way, and I wanted to double click into that because I almost feel like that's the part where I don't think that you can necessarily max out on technical skill, but I do feel like with technical skills, it's usually binary, right? Do you know
Yep.
SQL? Do you not know SQL? Do you know Python? Do you not know Python? Like it's really that simple. I think with soft skill, there's no test to really say like you're a master. In fact, I've realized, for example, as someone who's growing my skill as a public speaker, just the fact that I'm doing that is making me recognize when I am in the presence of great public speakers. So I didn't even know before, right? Now I know what to look for. And I'm not even there, right? But as I'm training myself to be more intentional about that, I'm now seeing what really stands some people apart from the rest of us, right? From the rest of us mere mortals. So in your situation, can you break it down, for example, like what were those things that you started to realize more, right? And maybe the part two of that question is, so for someone who's maybe coming to this realization too, what are some of the ways that you can start to build those, soft skill muscles, those communication? Like, what are the things that you identify and what are the things that you can do?
Yeah. So I always make this fun joke every time I speak to an audience. The last time I wrote code commercially for any company is probably like 9 years ago. I do it for pet projects. I don't like writing code. However, we're sort of in the world that I live in, everybody wants to be a developer. So everybody wants to learn JavaScript. Everybody's learning Python, and it's good. But I think then if you then just learn the language, but then you don't know what to do with it, then it's kind of pointless. And I think, as you said earlier, it's a journey. So there's no sort of, I'm a master of this thing. It's something that you build continuously over time. So for me, it was some tough situations. It was experiencing everything that a large corporate can bring, where On one side you're busy trying to do your job, on the other side you kind of have to deal with politics, on the other side then you also have to master your technical skill. Because if I then have to sit down with a CIO of a company or a CTO, I need to be able to speak his language and that he understands that I know what I'm saying. Because half of the time I'm busy convincing them, hey, the thing you're doing, why don't you try it on the Microsoft cloud? So one, I had to keep up my technical skill, and then I started to learn, and it's something I picked up due to a bad experience. I got curious about how people behave, and so at some point in my life, I did a short course on social psychology, just to help me understand how do human beings behave, because I realized that yes, I was good technical wise, but then I'm spending most of my time talking to people, convincing people, getting people to see my side of things, right? And so I realized the only way I can get good at it is to understand human behavior. Because if I'm going to handle conflict, how do I de-escalate conflict? How do I know what fights to fight and which ones to walk away? So I think there's quite a number of interesting things you kind of pick up on the way, and I know people get excited and think, oh, let me jump into tech, let me transition, let me learn Python, and all of a sudden I'll get good. I think one of the things I always tell my friends is it depends on your motivation. So if your motivation getting into tech is about money, it's gonna get hard. Learning how to code, learning how to build software is as hard as any other job, right? And so you kind of have to, at some point, understand why am I there? What's the thing that's driving me? And so once you slowly start to understand that, and how does it now the things that you love, your passion, align with your job? Um, then you start to enjoy it. So like I know I don't like writing code, and so even as I transition roles, I am very intentional about the kind of job I take up. So like at some point I figured out I love building stuff for people. I love giving people amazing experiences, and so I knew I want to go into the product space and build like a lot of core competency. And so along the way I'll get all these offers with exciting salaries and benefits, and I'm like, no, 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 I have a sort of direction of where I'm going, and I want to build core competency in one place. And so I'm going to align everything I do to that. So I think, if you have a North Star or a goal that you're trying to achieve in terms of your career, I think it will be a good guiding star. So you don't get caught up in because you can really get caught up in, oh, JavaScript is a thing now, so let me learn JavaScript. Next, it's, oh, Python is a thing. And then you get into PHP and C# wars, and then, everything gets exciting. So if you're not careful and you don't have, mentors as an example, you can easily get lost in the whole tech world. Um, I realize I can speak a lot, so let me pause there.
No, no, no. But those were really good because it was one of the questions I was going to ask you, and now since you kind of like started answering it, we'll probably just bring it home. So, what is the right formula, right? Because I know like you probably went the institutional route of going to college, learning it, and then coming out. So, you probably had a guide, but I think it's always taken for granted how tough this journey can be when you don't have a North Star, when you don't have a community. Because in college, you have a curriculum. If they say it's time to learn data structures and algorithm, it's time to learn data structures and algorithm. You can't say, no, I'm going to go make up my own course. But that might be frustrating, but at least you have a designed approach. For people who don't have that, what is the best way? And maybe we can make it like skill agnostic, right? Whether it's JavaScript, Python, whatever else. What do you think is a good formula for someone who's trying to get in completely brand new to basically move a journey?
Ooh, that's quite an interesting question. So for me, or sort of from where I come, I sit. I think if you can figure out where your passion is, and what's the thing that drives you, I think it becomes sort of like a good guiding path to where you want to be. And simply because some people get into tech by default, other people get into different careers, and then they eventually figure out, hey, maybe I want to transition. So I think if you're able to figure out, what's your passion, what's your motivation to where you're going, I think it's really important. Now, people early in career, it's gonna be a while before you figure that stuff out, right? But I think a good place to start is to pick one area in tech and build a core competency. So I and I'll be honest, I didn't have a core competency by the time I left Microsoft. I had done everything. I was solution architect on one side. I was speaking at events, and I was a public speaker. Like I kind of was over the place. And I remember at some point somebody asking me, "So what are you actually good at?" And I was like, "Yeah, actually, I don't know. Like I can do everything." So I think early on, if you can pick a core competency and say, hey, maybe I want to be a front end guy and get really, really good at that. And in that journey, it'll help you understand, okay, where do I want to fall? What makes sense? What do I actually enjoy? Because the beauty about tech, I can say, hey, let me be a front end guy, and in that you kind of learn a little about almost everything everywhere else. So you learn about cloud, you learn about databases, you learn about UI UX. And so if you can build a core competency, one, it allows you to get through the door of most employers, because then, you know, yeah, I used to joke around and tell people I'm a PHP guy through and through. um, and so at any point, if anything breaks, I can go back to PHP. And that's my core competency at some point. And so if you figure that out early and you stick it and get really good at it, it allows you to sort of have one path and then you can jump back and forth. Um, for people now who are non-technical trying to transition into tech, transitioning straight from non-technical into I'm a software engineer is the most difficult journey you will ever have to do. Because so remember, by the time people finish college, they're already a couple of years ahead of you, and you're all competing in the same job market. And so I tell people, interesting roles that people can look at is design, UI UX, product, because it kind of gives you an idea of where tech plays a role, but you sort of don't get into the meat of writing code.
Mm,
And so, like, I've seen people transition from pilots to being a product manager, or a doctor to being a PM. Because if you're in a health tech, no software engineer understands the human body better than a doctor, right? And so that's an easy
mm,
transition into the tech world. So you kind of help the engineers figure out what they need to build, and in that you start to understand, okay, cool, I now understand how to architect software. And then you can slowly start to build your technical skill around that, and you might find that you actually enjoy product, and because there's a whole side of product that is non-technical. So there's little things people can do to sort of get into the tech space. I think jumping straight from non-technical into writing code it's possible, just a very difficult path.
That's a really good way to close it. So, kind of like across all your different roles, working with different companies and working with different startups and things like that, what did you enjoy the most about it? And I asked that question because, like, of course, compensation in tech is great. I think that's one of the reasons why everybody wants to be there. But I think that there's also something that it gives you that I think is beyond money, right?
Yeah.
I'll probably say, like, for teachers, they get gratification for, like, educating and empowering people. For doctors, they're saving lives. I definitely don't think that tech is maybe on that level, but I still think that there's other things to get out of it that's not even just money. So for you, what do you enjoy, about being in this industry and working in industry and being able to contribute?
One, the traveling. So early in my career, my boss gave me the chance to travel quite a lot. So I traveled all over Africa. But out of that experience, one of the things I learned that I'm really good at is people, engaging with people. I think I've built myself such an amazing network of people all over the continent. Um, because then interacting with all sorts of people, having conversations, gives you a completely different worldview of what happens out there. So if I just stayed in Kenya and never left the country, I'd have a very narrow mindset of one, how the world works. But then also, because of that traveling, meeting different people, listening to different perspectives, engaging with all sorts of people, it also now gives me a very different perspective of, simple things like when people talk about scale in technology. Most people think, oh, I can build a solution, I have a million users or maybe something like that. I'm looking at, okay, cool. How do I get this all over the world? So I have a completely different view of tech. So even now, when I'm in my product space and I'm building a solution sitting in Nairobi, my mind is not just looking at Nairobi. It's thinking, okay, cool. If we take this thing and dump it in the Philippines, does it work? How do you start to architect for that scale at the early stages? So I think the traveling really exposed me to a whole different worldview. Um, and I think just people. I think I found myself at some point loving teaching. And so any chance and any opportunity I will get to go onto a stage and talk about tech, even to a non-tech audience, I will take it. So I love the people side of tech. The code, not so much.
That's so interesting. And I think it's so funny. One of my previous guests was actually as a software engineer. She actually became a software engineer trying to build a Shopify website, and she realized that she enjoyed the coding more than she actually enjoyed the building of this stuff shop and selling this stuff, right? I'm like, I don't know that people like you exist, but I guess you're out there. But
Yeah.
again, one of the things that I think is so interesting about your journey is that, very few people will get to work at, large tech companies like Microsoft and Google, right? And maybe very fewer will get to work in, maybe two or more of the traditional FAANG companies, right? So, what was that experience like for you? And was that something that you expected was going to happen?
No, absolutely not. It is by pure luck. So I say to my friends, I don't take my career journey for granted because there's people who open the doors for me. And it was by pure accident and luck that one day I was walking through college and I saw a Microsoft banner outside some room and I walked in and I was like, okay, cool, this is interesting. Like, what is Microsoft doing on my campus? And so I talked to people, and all of a sudden, at some point when they had an internship, they're like, "Hey, Somet, why don't you come join us?" But then also, I had a slightly different experience of the large tech companies than most. So most people get into a traditional fan company. You get the work assigned to you, and you're like a drop in the ocean, right? So if you think
A
about
cog in the wheel.
exactly. I happened to join a team called Microsoft for Africa, which was this team that was chartered with the responsibility of figuring out. So, and this is like way back 15 years ago. Our job was to figure out, okay, if we're gonna come and sell cloud services in Africa, what do we need to invest in now so that that makes sense in the future? And so, I think one of the early projects I worked on was connectivity, at some point skills. And so I got to work in an unconventional team in a large multinational that had the license to experiment, try and make mistakes and build cool stuff. And so I think I had one of the coolest experiences ever because I got to just work on cool stuff and also across the different parts of the company. So I wasn't sort of limited to Africa. I could, work with a team in India and figure out how what they're building makes sense in Mozambique, as an example, or
Mm.
talk to Xbox and say, hey, how do you guys figure out Xbox in Africa? And so I got to sit in rooms where traditionally most people would never. I don't take it for granted. I think it's goodwill relationships that I've built over time that have enabled me there, but also just putting in the work. There are those days. I remember launching Windows 10 in Nairobi, and we had the CEO coming to Nairobi. It was just crazy. There's times was working till midnight. Like I think I was even late to my graduation because I was busy trying to figure out the Windows 10 launch. And so there's the hard side and work of it. But you get to experience a completely different view of technology. So, you get to sit in rooms where people talk about stuff. I'm like, how do you guys figure this stuff? And then now you then go to another one of those companies and then you realize it's also a whole different monster in its own. So none of these companies are similar to each other. They do borrow a lot from each other, but their ethos, the way they think, the way they so like I'll give you a good example. By the time Microsoft launches, let's say the Africa Development Center in Nigeria and in Nairobi, that's a discussion that's been ongoing for 8+ years. And they go down to figuring out the tiniest of details. While if you go to the Google side of things, they're like a startup. They experiment like, hey, we want to try this thing, we're gonna build it out, and they're gonna put it out. And if it works, well and good. They do the thing we tell developers to do is fail fast. And that's exactly what they do. And so transitioning between those two becomes interesting. And then also because my role then also allowed me to talk to so many different kinds of startups, I then had a completely different view of tech itself and what it can do for people. So, simple things like that people don't think about. So, where does tech play a role in cultural heritage? Or where
Mm,
does tech play a role in you preserving an entire population's culture? Like that's or
mm,
accessibility. So people don't think about how much tech is now a part of our lives. I think
mm,
people get excited. Oh, let me write this website, this app. People throw it out there. People get excited, but I'm like, there's so much more that can happen. So if a hurricane swept through whatever country, where does tech play an interesting role in disaster
mm,
recovery? So those aspects I
mm.
got to experience that completely different side of tech than most people um, take years to experience, which for me it's completely interesting, and it's shaped who I am today.
And it's so fascinating because one, you've also been lucky to kind of like live both worlds, maybe even in some cases like vicariously through the startups, because I think it's definitely like a different experience, right? Working in big tech, you get the nice salaries, nice benefits, all of that. But I think like you talked about it, like it can feel a bit like being a cog in a wheel, right? You just feel like you're just another number through the door, right? But also being in a startup, of course, roller coaster, can literally run out of money tomorrow and now you're looking for a new job. Like it comes with its own challenges, but you've gotten to do both of that. And you talk about something that I think is also not talked about enough is that this share scale companies, like, disaster recovery is something that like doesn't even figure in most people's minds, right? Like that's almost like government policy level stuff, right? But many of these companies are involved in things like that because of that scale, right? So I guess being that you've kind of like transitioned out of big tech into this company that I imagine is kind of like growing, right? What is that shift in experience? And I'm asking specifically because, for a lot of people, of course, if you're trying to break into tech, I would imagine that one of the things that you're trying to do is to get a job and things like that. How can you give a sense of what working in those different environments look like?
Yeah. So it was actually what I call it a rude shock, and a very interesting transition. Because I think I was in big tech for probably close to 9 or 10 years. And then, yes, I was sitting on the other side talking to startups and get excited about the stuff they build. Now I get the opportunity to actually sit in one and influence change. And then you experience it's a whole different thing. So simple things that I gotten comfortable with, like structure, like the stuff I never had to think about in my
Documentation.
that was sorted out, right? Structures, job levels, operational stuff. And now at a startup, you get to build all that. So you get to so like for my current role, so I sit as a head of product for a company that's now sort of at its hyper scale, Poa Internet. That's now we're looking to now to expand into a new country, and I have to take all the learnings that I think like I picked up in Microsoft, and now start to think about, okay, cool, so there's this stuff I'm building that's traditionally designed for this country. How do I start to change people's mindset to say, hey, we're not just building for the next country but for the next several countries. So there's this one interesting talk I do called Building for the Next Billion Users, borrowed from Google. But when you start to think about, okay, there's this cool thing that works well, and then what happens to the next billion users, because nuances will change, things will change. And so you sort of sit in this place where people look up to you to make those decisions, but also you have to influence that change. Because then in a startup,
Mm,
especially if one that's been around for a bit, you'll find places where people got comfortable with their bare minimum, and I'm like, no, let's challenge the
mm,
status quo. Let's get people to think beyond what they're used to, because human nature is that we tend to get very comfortable with what we know, and that's why
mm,
people sort of get scared every time there's a big change in a company. So once you kind of have to now get people comfortable with change, saying to people,
mm,
hey, I'm going to change this thing you have been doing for the last 4 years, and you think it's right, but maybe it's not. Um,
mm,
maybe let's think about it differently, and find a way to communicate so that somebody doesn't think, oh my God, my job is going to go away.
mm,
So I think one of the skills that I picked up in back in the day in big corporate that I think has been a blessing to me is interacting with people, right? So, and then I'm young. I have to then work with people who are twice my age. And then African culture, somebody looks at you and says, "Oh, you're young. What do you know?" Right? So there's all these nuances that I picked up. And then also learning psychology, human behavior, that has really helped me now sit in a startup and one influence a lot of change, and stuff that people have been very comfortable doing for a while. So I think that's the thing I enjoy the most, that you kind of get your hands dirty into the thick of things. I'm not just, hey, there's this little part of the world that I'm responsible for, but you sit there and there's all this entire thing that you own. But also, um, it also has changed the way I manage people. So where I make this joke with my team and I say to them, if I notice and if I'm still around that you're slacking off and you're comfortable in this job, I will push you out. Or simple things I tell them, if you get to a point in your career where you feel that your next career opportunities in another company, help me, tell me, so that I can find a way in which I can leverage the opportunities that you have here to enable you for that next job. And people find it weird, right? Because I'm like, this company does not own you. So if you know your opportunities elsewhere, let me help you get there. Because then I'm happy to see people grow. So big tech experience completely changes the way people manage, with the way I do people management. All right, let me
yeah,
pause there.
yeah,
I can
yeah.
go.
That's a very, very good nuance, and I think it kind of like checks with. Of course, I've spent most of my time on the startup side, newly new to like this. I joke with someone and say like, it's so funny how we all write on our resumes that uh, comfortable. I don't know the specific words, but something around like comfortable in metrics and highly complex organization. But I'm like, no, I'm not comfortable because it's like it's just so much that you have to deal with. You do meetings to do meetings to do meetings, and like it's like I think oftentimes the more institutional the company you work for, there's you can do like 80% of, I call it the difference between motion and movement.
Mhm.
A startup, it has to be more movement. In fact, if movement doesn't happen, the company dies. It's that simple. But in many of these big companies, there's a lot of motion and
Mhm.
very little movement. And
I,
it's
I make
it's it's definitely
I make this joke because
yeah.
once in my career I was on a team, where I had 15 engineers, and all they did was notifications and nothing else. And so imagine for 6 months, all you're doing is just notifications. At some point, somewhere, you're like, okay, it has to be bigger than this. But when you're one out of 25,000 engineers in one place, it's a whole different ballgame.
It
Um,
is. And oftentimes, like, of course, so in my opinion, like, it's not even always necessarily negative because when we talk about scale as this good thing, it can also be quote unquote, because CrowdStrike is a really great example. When things like that happen, you turn around and say, why is there not more rigor? Well, what is rigor? Rigor is bureaucracy, is red tape, is double testing, is iteration. So the same way like a startup can build the code tonight, roll it out tomorrow morning, it's not going to happen for many of those companies. And oftentimes the impact, the short-term impact is already hit, but that incident alone can be the reason why another competitor will basically take their place in the market, because that question mark now exists. It's almost like when they say first impressions. The first impression that they've created, no matter all the good work, and it's like, especially with infrastructure like that, it's almost like being a goalkeeper in soccer, right? All the great saves you make don't really matter. It's the bloopers that everybody remembers. So for many of those companies, it's so important to not have those mistakes. And oftentimes there's so much like redundancy and like extra capacity built into it, and even extra like bureaucracy to make sure that it's hard to change. Just so that like when a change happens, it's basically thoroughly vetted, checked, and goes through. So that's definitely like something that I've also gotten to be a bit more comfortable with as someone who's come from a startup environment where it's like, what did we ship today? What are we shipping tomorrow? What's going out next Monday? you know. So my next question is, working in Africa and working, outside of Africa with different teams. What are some of the differences or nuances in those things, and how have you been able to navigate that?
I think the biggest one is this culture and language. Simple things around how we communicate. So, like one of the things I teach my team is to pay attention to how they ask for certain things. So, right now I have a team, an outsourced engineering team sitting in India. And in most cases, you have to be careful how you ask questions. There's this thing that always happens. I tell my friends, you go ask this person, hey, is this possible? Higher chances they will go build it out and then say, oh, yes, it can be done. So I have to ask and say, hey, this is just a question. I'm just curious if this is actually possible. Please don't go build it. Because then different places have different ways in which they communicate and what certain things mean, and even just behavior. So you might find a culture where people have this mindset of, oh, the customer is always right, and so they will never push back if they believe something to be wrong, and so they'll just power through it, right? So there's those little nuances of how people communicate in different teams. And then there's this culture of how people handle themselves, because certain things might mean some certain different things in one place. So I remember at some point somewhere I was in a team of 13 people, of which 11 were Egyptians. And so
Hmm.
it's very natural that at some point things in a meeting get heated and people switch to Arabic. And so I have to constantly remind people, hey guys, let's be cognizant of
Let's bring it
non-Arabic
back.
speakers in the room, right? And so sometimes people overlook those things, and especially like now sitting in Kenya, where people are so used to speaking in, and we call it Sheng. It's a mix of Swahili and English, and people are comfortable because that's the way they speak, and they assume everyone in the room can speak that, or just making assumptions on people's religions, respecting people's beliefs. And so if somebody says to you, hey, this particular day of the year we celebrate this thing, and so I'm not going to be at work, people have to now be considerate of how other people's personal lives come into play. And so there's
Hmm.
you kind of get to learn how to work with all sorts of different people and learn, um, you know, um, then that West Africans will naturally be very, very aggressive, while in Tanzania people are very laid back. And so if you're planning times for meetings, if you're in Tanzania, plan a meeting in the afternoon, higher chances people will be dozing off. So it's little tiny little things that you pick up in different spaces, that are interesting. I think it's an amazing thing to learn. So yeah, those are the little cool, interesting stuff that I've picked up over time.
So, um, one of the things about building in Africa, the good part is that there's a lot that new. The bad part is that a lot of things are new, right? When and Amazon had to do it to an extent too, so I'll probably leave that caveat. But when Jumia was launching in Nigeria, they had to build their own payment system and logistics systems and all of that. Whereas like in the US, Amazon just plug and play into like the existing infrastructure. How has that, shaped your career, right? Understanding like the opportunity that exists because many things are new, but also the challenges where you can just say, oh, you know what? Don't worry about it. When we launch this new service, we're going to launch it on top of this other service that exists.
Yeah. So, fun facts: Africa has how many? 3,000 plus languages alone. And so, if you're building stuff and you have to do translation across it's a whole different. And then they're all of different sort of what I say. So some languages are based off of Latin, some of them are based off of a different kind of language. So one, you have 3,000 languages, you have 54 countries, each with its own different way in which it works. I've been reading a book called "That's Never Gonna Work," or that will not work, by the founder of Netflix. I think it's called Mark, and he talks about when he was building Netflix and he needed to, okay, cool, we're gonna launch in a new state. The postal service that he used to ship DVDs is the same across almost the entire of the US. So he never has to worry about, oh, wait, so I have to build another logistics engine in a different state. But now I'm building a thing in Nairobi. Payment service here is predominantly mobile money. You jump into South Africa, it's predominantly debit or credit card. You jump into Nigeria, it's bank transfers. And so there's people already who've kind of built layers on top of this, and they figured the different nuances of one, how do you send messaging, how do you do payments, how do you do all these things across different countries. So the belief that you can do it all on your own is not on this continent. You kind of have to leverage the strengths of other people to especially scale, and then you have to be very picky which markets you go to. So little nuances like, yes, Nigeria has a big population, but maybe South Africa has a higher propensity to spend. And so
Mm,
you might look at that, and if you're just looking at a dashboard somewhere, you're like, oh,
mm,
cool, Nigeria has a huge population. That's where we go. But then you get there, and then your addressable market is like this small,
mm,
versus maybe you start in Kenya and the regulations are a bit easier. Or Rwanda, yes, is the most amazing place, easiest place in Africa to start a business, but then it's a tiny country, right? And so, how big of a market are you going to serve? So there's those tiny little
mm,
nuances that you pick over time that change the way you think about building stuff. And so you kind of now have to start being picky about, okay, where do I start? What do I do? Which country to go next? So, like for the startup I work for now, Poa Internet, we've been busy trying to figure out how do you get internet in an underserved market for lower social economic class for the last 9 years. And
mm,
we're experimenting with install fees. How do you keep your churn rate low and all these interesting things? It took us 9 years to figure that stuff out. And now is when we're like, okay, cool. We figured it out in Kenya. Let's go try it in Uganda. And you're going to land in Uganda. And yeah, that payment service we built that works amazing in Kenya because of M-Pesa and mobile money. Yeah, in Uganda, it's a whole different story, right? Everything from regulation to even just behaviors of how people pay. So, are people used to subscriptions? Can you do regular recurrent billing? Little things like that that in most other countries is kind of almost a norm. On the continent, it's a
mm.
whole different story. Um,
And that could be, and I'm sorry to cut in there because that could be the difference between success and failure, right? Because if you, that's something that can contribute directly to churn. Because if there's no repeated, consistent way to collect money, it might not even be that the customer doesn't like the service, but oftentimes, like when we pay for something and it's on a recurrent billing, we just pay for it even if we never use it. That's why, like in the US, like companies like to try to tie you to contracts because they know even the psychological stress of you getting out of it is more expensive to you uh, than staying. And I'll give a quick joke and I'll let you finish the answer. There's a streaming service, a car radio streaming service that they'll call you to sign up, but you have to go to a physical location to cancel your subscription. That is
yeah,
wild.
yeah.
But
I'll give,
any, Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm gonna give an example of a fun thing is happening in Kenya right now. So Starlink's been launching all over the continent, right? Cost of equipment is it was, I think in the US it's sitting somewhere at $800. Somebody in Kenya tweeted at Elon Musk and say, "Hey, we're going through this thing, lower the price," and all of a sudden that price has tanked. And all of a sudden, the current internet service, the most dominant internet service provider, is under threat because people assumed, hey, guys are not going to buy Starlink devices, and they're flying off the shelf like crazy. And so you might find nuances like how Kenya and Nigeria start Twitter wars that can end companies. Um,
It's so random.
yeah,
But so, I didn't have ask it specifically, but I appreciate you really going into detail, right? Because I think this was what I was gonna come to, right? As a head of product, which is almost like many levels above. One of the great things that I think that you bring, or one of the great things that I think about product managers is product sense, and I think you've showed even like a really good sense of it about the difference in markets, demographics, customer behavior, etc. So for as someone who's basically seen it all, what would you advise someone? Because product is one of those in demand, stylish, trendy roles, right?
yeah,
But it's not as easy, at least, as most people try to make it come off. I think anybody can be a product manager, just the same way anybody can be a soccer player. I think the difference is just the level you play, right? So
yeah.
if you want to play at the highest level, if you want to be the product manager that delivers value, what are the pre-work? What is the preparation that someone has to do to be ready for that opportunity?
Cool. So and actually, funny thing. So because I'm in the middle of recruiting right now, and I've been having that conversation with people. Um, I think the thing that you kind of have to get really good at is learning how to say no, and no without pissing everyone off. Because the thing about product is when now you're working in an organization where there's all these things happening and everybody's thing is an emergency and a priority, and everybody
Mm,
wants to combine every wild idea they have in their head into this tiny little product, and then people completely forget, okay, so what does the customer actually want, right?
mm,
And so sometimes we get caught up in thinking we know what the customer wants instead of listening to the customer. I think the
mm,
best thing people can figure out how to get good at product management. So it depends on whether you go into the technical side of being a PM, or the growth side of being a PM. Because I say people, the easiest way to transition is either you're technical and you're transitioning to becoming a PM, or you have deep domain knowledge. Um, so having a tech background really helps, or tech knowledge, understanding how software is architected, because there's times you will have to have conversations to explain to non-technical people why the thing in their head that seems so simple, when we translate it into software, it's going to look completely different. Or maybe there's an aspect of it that they never thought of. So having an understanding of, okay, when you see a bug, to a non-technical person, that's a bug, but maybe no, it's not a bug, it's an operational thing. Maybe they're just not doing the right thing. So
mm,
the one, being able to communicate, being able to
mm,
influence people. I taught, there's a meme in the product space where people are saying product managers are always in meetings, and we're always in meetings simply because we're trying to figure out a delicate balance between how do we build stuff that the customer actually wants, but also make sure the business doesn't die. Because if we just please a customer and nothing else, yeah, the company still needs to make money. So it's a very interesting sort of dance. So technical
mm,
background helps. Communication, learning to figure out how do you tell somebody, hey, this thing that you think is an emergency now doesn't necessarily break the entire business, doesn't grind the business to a halt. So maybe we'll prioritize this for a later time, and let's focus on making sure the core experience doesn't break. But also challenging the status quo, because you're gonna have people who will come to you. The guy with the fattest wallet will come to you and say, "Hey, this is the thing I want, and because I'm the CEO of the company, you're gonna build what I want." But maybe that's not what the customers want. So learning how do you navigate, working with people like that, working with senior people, influencing people. So because you can build expertise, but if you're not good at convincing people and having conversations with people, I think then as a PM you'd struggle. Um, I think, and also empathy. It's a really good, interesting thing to have to understand. While the thing that we're building is driven, the entire business is driven around revenue. How do I empathize sometimes with the customer or the beneficiary or whoever, but also at some point being careful not to create some level of entitlement, because then products can get
Mm,
very interesting.
yeah.
So I think, yeah, that's what I'd say.
That's a really good way to land it. And I thought it was interesting that you started with no, because almost like on the list of things, I probably wouldn't rank it that high before. But as you say it, I start to think about it. Um, it's definitely not the most important thing in product, but I would imagine that as you go higher and the stakes get higher, it becomes the most important thing. So it's definitely great to have your perspective on that. And it was definitely some of the things that, in my last role specifically, I tend to be really good at it. And because again, we worked with like, you know, sales teams across the globe, right? And they're, because of the market nuances that they work in, they want different features to support within our product to support their use cases. So it became this dance of literally figuring out how to say no. But we needed to collaborate with them closely to figure out what's the most valuable thing. Because if they ask, you're not giving it to them, why would they share their insight and be willing to engage? And one of the tools I found to be the most useful was just transparency. Oftentimes, like people tend to want to gatekeep and use like a lot of like lingo and like fluff words. You know exactly what I mean, like the circle backs and all of these things. But I just realized that I could be honest, right, and just say, look, we already like booked this entire PI. We can't do it. Even next PI, we have this new platform redesign that we're trying to do, and that's top priority. Why? Because half of the tickets that we get today is because people don't know where anything is sitting within the tool. We've made so many changes that it's becoming so challenging to keep with this platform, and this is really key. So, and your organization is just one of, let's say, six geo zones that we're servicing. So we're not hearing the same feedback from everybody else. We would like to support you. Or, you know what? If it's this report, I can even give you one of my data analysts, 1 hour every week to help you pull that report, clean it up so that they can send it to you on a weekly cadence. Right. So I don't have to go do all these dev hours. I already have the resource. But I think that willingness to help and being completely open, because if I tell you I have these challenges, right? Again, we're all human.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be crazy if I told someone like I'm completely booked this PI and next PI is already dedicated to someone and you still come back and say, build it for me anyway, right? But
Mm.
oftentimes I think a lot of the pushback comes from like, I don't feel like you, it almost feels like you're laughing in my face, right? You're not telling me what's going on. And now I'm, so anyway, I think that was something that I found to be very useful was like being open communication, being realistic. And oftentimes, like if it's not going to work, just say it's not going to work, right? So it could be a technical challenge. It could be capacity challenge. It's always one of those things, right? But being able to communicate and share your frustration also like with why this can move, I think is always very key.
Mm.
So we're going to go to questions. Again, so if you have any questions for Somet, please leave them in the chat. We might go a little over today because we started a little late, but we'll try to keep it on the 5 to 10 minutes. But what strategies have helped you, in being able to basically share the bad news?
I think I'll start with the thing you said, being entirely honest. Because the minute you start to, so human nature will get people to get to the extent of people pleasing because you want to make sure everybody's comfortable, everybody's happy, right? But the reality on the ground is sometimes the thing's broken and there's nothing we can do about it. Or if we're going to fix it, it's going to take time, right? So that transparency and honesty about, hey, here's the reality of what's going on, here's what we're doing to fix it. And I think if you start to give people visibility on what's the stuff that's happening in the background. So give you a fun story. The other day, my team member comes to me and says, I'm working with this stakeholder and they complain to me because they don't feel like they're heard, because they have all these requirements and features that they're expecting to be shipped, but it's been week after week and it's not coming out. And I said to her, hey, have you thought of pulling that person into one of your meetings so that they have a good understanding of, here's a workload that you have, and here's what your pipeline looks like, and then that way they start to appreciate the work that you do. And that made us that just visibility, where, because sometimes when you sit in product and you're working with stakeholders who have no idea what happens in the background, because I think sometimes, as you said, people like to hide in the jargon and the lingo, but sometimes it's like, hey guys, here's a board, here's all the stuff that's in flight right now, and this is the reason why this is taking time. I think that transparency is very key, but also it boils down to, how do you say what you say? Maybe it's sometimes not what you say, it's how you say it. um,
Mm.
Understanding when somebody comes to you when they're in a heightened state of emotions, how do you find ways to navigate that, and so that you don't end up in a fight or an exchange of harsh words? How do you de-escalate and the situation, or how do you find other alternatives to communicate where you are? Because sometimes people will come in with all manner of frustrations for something that is completely unrelated to the product and dump it on you. And so you kind of have to have the, would I say, understanding of people's behaviors, and know, okay, cool. Uh, Maybe the thing that they're trying to say to me and the thing they're complaining about is not necessarily product related. Maybe it's something completely different. So I think that just, would I call it wisdom? And it's not something you're gonna pick up early in career. It's gonna take time to
It
build up,
comes with time.
because you
Yep.
interact with people, you now start to understand how people behave. Um, I think those are the strategies that have helped. Is just honesty. Hey guys, it broke. Somebody shipped a thing and it broke somewhere, or we did a migration and somebody messed up something. So I think just that transparency has worked for me. But also being able to, like, really be good at what you're doing, because then sometimes people are going to ask you questions to test how much you know. And so at the end of the day, you still have to be really good at explaining things to people. So I found myself, like just as recent as 2 days ago, trying to explain to somebody who's completely non-technical a technical piece of thing, but in a language that they would understand, why we ended up in a situation where a feature that they're dependent on completely broke. And so that little influence where you can get people to listen to you, I think is it's cool, and it's stuff you're gonna pick up over time. One of the things that how I learned it early in career, I figured out, I might not be good at writing code, but I'm hell good at talking. So I used to go and speak at events. Like half of the time, I don't even know the thing that I'm speaking on, but because I have enough knowledge to be able to hold conversations, it really boosted my confidence that at any one point, anyone can throw a question at me. And to some extent, I'll be able to give you an answer and not fabricate something off of my head. I
Mm.
think just exposing yourself widely to what's possible out there. So, like last week, I was pushing my team to say, "Hey, this thing where you guys still want to do this thing manually, no, there must be a way. Like it's possible under the sun. Like push the limits of what you know, because if you don't push the boundary of what technology can do." I love this quote from a famous musician called Common, and he says, "You have more power at your fingertips than entire generations that came before you." And people really
Mm.
underestimate that, because there's so much tech can do, and what the possibilities are just amazing. And so don't get comfortable. Like there's
Mm.
all the, I mean, if Elon Musk figured out how to, build rockets at a fraction of the cost of what NASA does,
And it's even
then
better, right? And that's not even his that like that's not what that's not like a side quest, right? A side
yeah,
mission. That's not even his day job.
Yeah.
Okay, so we do have this question from Trey. It says, "What's a mistake to avoid if I'm new to tech or product?"
Trying to learn all of it at once,
Mm.
and chasing trends. So when there's a new JavaScript flavor out there and everybody's trying to learn it, you can get lost in it very quickly. So I like, I think, as I said earlier, if you can pick one area and get really good at it, and then slowly then transition, I think that's a good place to be in, rather than, oh, so JavaScript is an, and by the way, I have nothing against JavaScript. I'm just using it as an example. So the JavaScript guys, don't butcher me. But let's say that's a
You can
new
find him on
thing.
LinkedIn if you want to argue about JavaScript. I'm joking.
Yeah. Or if there's this new thing, AI is now the buzzword and everybody's talking about it. If you're the person who's chasing trends all over the place, you can get lost very easily. So I think building core competency is the best thing that you can do. So start small, and build over time. And I think that's a good place to be in.
Mm. I usually don't chime in there, but it brings to a story that I'm just going to tell very quickly. So, someone who used to work with me rather, um, is be has always had data skills. The initial data skill he had was just Excel. He could do things in Excel that I didn't even think was possible with code or things like that. He was that good. And of course, after we stopped working together, he went to work in other roles and focused more, maybe built other skills as SQL, all of this other stuff. Now he's VP of product. He didn't have any formal training as a product, as a data person. He just learned one skill really well. And that was good. I think people, in my mind, of course, I'm probably not exposed to so many people who know Excel. But even today, he's the best person I've experienced manipulate an Excel file. And that speaks a lot, right? So I think people underestimate, even like, it's not about the fanciest, latest, quirkiest thing that but it's that, can anybody around you say, you know what? Maybe it's PHP. Maybe it's even something that people don't really, a lot of people still use, but maybe they don't like to talk about it anymore because it's not fancy. But can they say, like, this guy is the best PHP developer I've ever seen, period?
Yeah.
And I think that if you get to that level, even layering other things on top of that becomes easier. So I think that's kind of like something that I'll say to that question. And then the second question from Trey saying, also, are there any courses I can take to build skills in product, or is it just all about experience?
So here's a fun thing about product. It's not like computer science where there's like an entire university degree about it. But I will point you to a very interesting resource. So there's a thing called Product School. Yeah, I think it's Product School. And this is, I think, a company that built a curriculum around product, but it's taught by actual product managers. So you'll be learning product from a VP of product at Meta or a product senior product manager at Google. I think that's the best resource anyone who's looking to get into product can start with. There's a YouTube channel called Exponent that will help you navigate PM
Interviews?
interviews. Yeah, I think those are interesting resources. And then just staying insanely curious. There's so much about product you can learn by just looking at the products that you use every day and asking yourself, so what goes into building this thing? Why did whoever made the decision put this feature in? So sometimes just looking at the things that you deal with day to day, and being curious. So one of the fun questions I love asking at interviews is, I tell people to build a fridge for kids, and that will help you really, because sometimes we get excited and we're like, oh cool, we're gonna build this fridge, it's gonna have colors, it's gonna have lights, and it's gonna do all these things. I'm like, but do kids really need a fridge? Maybe they don't, right? And so most of the time being a PM is constantly asking why, like, why are we building the thing that we're building, and do people actually need it, right? So I think that's the best thing about being a PM, just staying insanely curious. I think reading also really helps.
It's so interesting that you say that because I don't know how I typically feel about those questions. They really, really stress me out. Um, because like I'm not so good in thinking in hypotheticals. I prefer to think about real, tangible
Yeah.
things. So because it's not something I really care about, like building fridge for kids, it almost puts me in a mind. But of course, I'm having to learn because if I'm in
Yeah.
this role in this industry, then this is the standard, then I'll have to
No, so let
do
me
it.
tell
But
you the rationale behind it. So when I ask people
mm,
that question, I honestly do not care about the answer.
mm,
My what I'm trying to establish is how does somebody think? How do you take that
mm,
thing that looks complicated and break it down into tiny little components that you can
mm,
actually ground in reality and build? So
mm,
if you constantly ask questions and try and ask, okay, cool, why do kids need a fridge? Who are these kids? How old are they? Naturally every
mm.
human being's instinct is, oh, jump into building the fridge, but maybe
Yeah,
take a
yeah, of
step back.
course.
That's what I'm trying to establish is somebody, because that's, if you think about it, and we'll go back to the Elon Musk example. He took a thing that NASA did that was crazy expensive and said, hey, if you break down this rocket into tiny little components and figure out how to get this as cheap as possible and build it back into one, you can significantly lower the cost. So sometimes it's just, hey, take this thing that looks
No,
impossible, break it down into things, and you'll be
it,
surprised at what you
it,
find.
it is so magical. I think I actually, so I think funny thing is that I've always liked to think that way. In fact, like, I think one of the reasons why I'm not super technical is because just the amount of time it takes for me to really learn something. For example, I currently work in a cloud role and I'm learning more and more. And like the thing that threw me off for the loop the most was like, why are, copies of settings in the cloud called images? Like, why is it an image? Like, because I understand what it is, but I'm asking, like, why did someone, right? The closest answer that somebody said is like, it's maybe off of like, copies of images that because you create these settings and it becomes a setting is almost like a copy and paste. It doesn't fully do it for me. So I'm still in search of that answer. Like, why is it called an image? And I think
I
that that's
think
the level. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to make a joke. Tech is the worst place to do that because we have very weird names for products. Like who came up with Kubernetes?
I mean, see, you know why I can live with that, right? Because Kubernetes is not a word. At least maybe it is, but I've not encountered it. But I know what an image
Yeah,
is, right? Because, for
yeah,
example, like
yeah.
when I hear cloud, of course, there's no cloud, right? These are just servers sitting remotely. But I get the idea of it. Like a radio wave, like a wave, right? But I understand like why it's called radio waves. So it is, I get it. But for this one, I've still not gotten it. And I think oftentimes I probably spend more time getting stuck on that one thing than actually moving forward and just accepting it as what it is. But I know that we're over time. This has been like a really enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. This is usually like, where if you have any last comments, you have anything you want to plug, you have any shout outs, it's time to do it.
Um, I always like to end with almost the same thing which I said earlier. I borrow a lot from other people. Um, you have more power at your fingertips than entire generations that came before you. What will you do with it? Like, stay insanely curious. I think there's so much, so many things in the world that we can discover and really push the boundaries of. And especially if you work in the tech space, that like there's so many things that you can possibly do. And so I tell people, stay insanely curious. So, like, fun story. I, for some weird reason, at some point in my life, was studying quantum physics, back to your early example of why a sound wave is called a wave. And then you come across things like wave particle duality. And I'm just like, it explains a lot of things. So I stay insanely curious. I go into nasty rabbit holes of reading things. And I think that's what's helped me really push the boundaries of when I have to face a problem and how do I navigate it? How do I share the experiences that I have? So stay insanely curious is what I'd close with.
Yeah, so Matt, this has been really, really great. It's really great having you. Um, Definitely, I don't know if I think you mentioned about talks. If you have anything that we can link in the comments that people could go watch, just to get a better sense of you and your work, please send it
Yeah.
over. We'll definitely put it in the comments. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks everyone for joining the Working in Tech live stream. We'll be back.